He never fired a bullet. Yet his bees would one day help silence the guns of Europe. Summer 1944. Across the endless fields of Iowa, the morning light spilled gold over the rows of corn and the neat wooden hives lined beside a weathered red barn. The air carried two sounds that never seemed to belong in the same world. The soft hum of bees, steady and gentle, and the distant thunder of engines, heavy and defiant. To Samuel Walker, those sounds had become the rhythm of his life, a reminder that while the world was burning, his corner of it remained too quiet. Sam was 38, a mechanic by trade before a knee injury ended his chance to fight. The Army doctor had stamped his file with one letter that haunted him more than any wound could. 4F, unfit for service. While his friends shipped off to Europe and the Pacific, he stayed home with his aging mother, tending to bees and broken tractors. Every jar of honey he harvested was a small victory over loneliness, but every newspaper headline that spoke of invasion or sacrifice only deepened the guilt pressing on his chest. He often stood at the edge of his fields, wiping the sweat from his brow, watching the contrails of bombers arcing high above. They were B-17s from a nearby training base, flying low enough that the windows of his farmhouse rattled. Sam would glance up, jaw tight, thinking of the boys inside those planes, some barely old enough to shave. He didn't wave. He rarely did anymore. What would a farmer with bad knees have to say to the men carrying the war on their backs? The smell of summer hung heavy, clover, dust, and the sweet thickness of honey. When he opened a hive, the bees swarmed in disciplined chaos, each one knowing its place, its duty. Sam often thought the bees were the only soldiers he'd ever command. He worked with slow precision, scraping combs, collecting amber gold into glass jars that caught the light like small suns. Each jar felt like a promise he couldn't keep, a contribution too small for a war that seemed infinite. Then, one afternoon, the sound of engines came not from above, but from the gravel road that ran past the barn. A green army truck rolled up in a haze of dust, its paint dull under the sun. The driver stepped out, uniform crisp, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Samuel Walker?" Sam wiped his hands on his overalls. "That's me?" The soldier scanned his paper. "We're requisitioning all surplus honey for the Army Quartermaster Corps. Orders from Washington." Sam frowned, unsure if he'd heard right. "Honey?" The soldier nodded. "Yes, sir. Sugar's rationed, and the Army needs every substitute it can get. For rations, medicine, even field kits. We've got a quota to meet." Sam watched as two men began loading the sealed jars into wooden crates. The sight made his stomach twist. Each jar represented weeks of work, each hive a living engine he'd nurtured since spring. Now they were being hauled off to somewhere he'd never see. "I guess even war needs something sweet," he said quietly. The soldier paused, giving a brief nod before climbing back into the truck. When the engine started, the bees reacted first, rising in a soft golden cloud that shimmered around the barn, confused by the vibration. Sam stood still, watching the truck disappear down the road, leaving only the hum of insects and the fading echo of its motor. The sky above was streaked with contrails again, white lines against a deepening blue, stretching eastward, the same direction his brother had gone months earlier. Somewhere beyond that horizon, men were fighting and dying. Here, he was left with bees and silence. He looked down at one last jar on the table, the sunlight glowing through it like liquid fire. Maybe this was all he was meant to do, feed the effort in small, invisible ways. But something inside him whispered that even small things could matter if used the right way. He didn't know it yet. But in less than 3 days, that same honey would stop a convoy from dying and make even German engineers take notes. For now, all Samuel Walker knew was the loneliness that came when the sun dipped behind the Iowa cornfields, and the house fell quiet except for the low hum of bees settling in for the night. He sat by the kitchen window, a coffee gone cold beside him, staring at the wooden radio that carried news from worlds away. Normandy, Rome, Saipan, places he could barely imagine but where his younger brother Daniel now fought. The letters came rarely, each one a lifeline. That night, a new envelope waited on the table, edges smudged, stamp torn from its corner, marked V-mail. Sam turned it over in his calloused hands before opening it carefully, as though the paper itself were fragile with distance. The letter inside was short, written in hurried pencil lines. Danny's handwriting slanted from exhaustion, his words steady but stripped of the cheer he'd always tried to fake before. "We're cold most nights," it read. "The engines freeze, the men too. If you send anything, send warmth. We freeze before we fight." Sam read the line again and again, whispering it under his breath. Send warmth. He looked around his small kitchen, the potbelly stove, the worn linoleum floor, the faint smell of wax and smoke, and felt utterly useless. How could a farmer in Iowa send warmth to men huddled in the mud of France? He stepped outside where the night air was thick with humidity and the distant croak of frogs. The bees were asleep in their hives, but a few stragglers buzzed near the lantern he carried, circling the light like tiny, tireless workers that never knew rest. He envied them, their purpose, their clarity. Inside the barn, he ran his hand across an old workbench littered with bolts, tools, and jars of hardened honey. Before the war, he'd fixed engines for half the county. He knew the smell of oil and metal like other men knew perfume. He had rebuilt tractors from scrap and coaxed rusted engines back to life. His body might have been grounded, but his hands remembered what it meant to make things move. He unscrewed a jar and dipped his finger into the thick amber. The honey glistened under the lantern light, slow and heavy. It clung to his skin the way tar clings to a road. Bees made this, he thought, made it to last. It didn't rot, didn't freeze, didn't break down. It was nature's own armor. He remembered his father's old trick, mixing beeswax with linseed oil to polish boots and waterproof belts. His grandfather had once used a dollop of honey to plug a radiator leak in a Model A Ford and made it home before it hardened. The thought lingered like a spark catching kindling. Maybe warmth wasn't only something you felt. It could be something you built. Something that protected. He looked toward the door, where the wind made the hinges creak. The sound scraped at him like guilt. He fetched a rag, a tin of oil, and an old jar of honey, mixing them together by instinct more than plan. When he rubbed the mixture into the hinges, the metal moaned once, then fell silent. The silence was so perfect, so sudden, it startled him. He opened and closed the door again. Nothing, just quiet. He stood there, lantern flickering in his hand, the faint scent of sweetness in the air. It wasn't much, but it was something. He thought of Danny's line, "Send warmth," and for the first time in months, Sam smiled. Maybe there was a way to send something more than prayers. Maybe the bees, his only soldiers, had been training for this moment all along. He spent the next day tinkering. He melted more wax, adjusted the ratio, tested it on an old tractor axle that had screamed every time it turned. The squeal faded into a low whisper. The mixture wasn't just silencing, it was sealing, protecting, resisting rust. The idea grew wild in his mind. He imagined trucks lined with the stuff, their metal joints muffled, their noise smothered by something as simple as honey. He shook his head at his own foolishness. Who would listen to a farmer's idea about bees? Yet the thought refused to die. That evening, rain came in sheets, hammering the tin roof. Sam sat by the workbench again, watching droplets roll down the window glass like melting wax. He took out Danny's letter, flattening the creases with his thumb. "If you send anything, send warmth." He whispered the words to himself, as if they were a command. Outside, the road had turned to mud, and the smell of wet earth mixed with the faint sweetness of honey from the open jars. The storm raged for hours before fading into a low drizzle. When the thunder finally stopped, another sound replaced it, the low growl of an approaching engine. Headlights swept across the window, cutting through the darkness. Sam rose slowly, unsure if he was imagining it. A military truck rolled into his yard, tires crunching on the gravel. The same olive-drab color, the same markings as before. Only this time, it carried something else besides soldiers and crates. It carried the perfect chance to test his idea. He wiped his hands on a rag, heart thudding, and stepped out into the rain as the truck came to a stop beside the barn. Maybe this was luck, or maybe fate had sent him the first volunteer. Either way, he wasn't about to let the opportunity pass. The driver climbed out first, followed by an officer in a wet field coat with the insignia of the Quartermaster Corps stitched to his sleeve. He was young, but already carried the weary stiffness of someone who'd been ordering and hauling supplies for far too long. The man introduced himself as Lieutenant Harold Brooks. He didn't bother with small talk. "We're here to pick up your honey shipment, Mr. Walker," he said, scanning his clipboard under the drizzle. "You still got the barrels ready?" Sam nodded, pointing toward the barn. "They're ready," he said, then hesitated. "Lieutenant, mind if I ask you something? What's the Army doing with all this honey anyway?" Brooks glanced up from his papers. "You'd be surprised. It's food, sure, but we're using it for med kits, waterproofing, even engine treatment in the field." He gave a humorless chuckle. "Truth is, we'll use anything that doesn't rust or spoil." Sam's ears caught on that last word. Engine treatment. "Engines giving you trouble?" he asked. The lieutenant gave him a long, tired look. "Trouble doesn't begin to cover it," he muttered. "Half our convoys in England sound like a parade of broken tractors. Every hinge, every joint screams. The noise carries for miles. The Germans hear us coming long before they see us." Sam stood silent for a moment, the rain tapping the brim of his hat. Then, almost before he could think, he said, "What if I told you I had something that could quiet those trucks?" Brooks raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "A mix I made myself," Sam said carefully. "Honey, wax, oil, works on metal, seals rust, kills noise. Just tried it on my door hinges. You can't hear a thing." The lieutenant let out a short laugh that was half disbelief, half exhaustion. "You want me to smear bee spit on Army trucks?" "You can call it whatever you like," Sam said evenly, "but it works." Brooks shook his head, ready to dismiss it, then looked back at Sam, the man's steady eyes, the confidence in his voice, the faint smell of smoke and honey clinging to his clothes. "Fine," he said finally, handing over a small metal tin from his belt. "You've got one shot, Mr. Walker. If your magic mix can shut this thing up, I'll take it to Fort Riley for testing." The truck was old, mud-caked, and every hinge shrieked like a wounded thing when it opened. Sam fetched a rag and his new concoction, stirring it once with a wooden stick before rubbing it into the metal joints. The smell of honey cut through the scent of diesel and rain. Brooks climbed back into the cab, turned the key, and shifted gears. The engine rumbled, low and smooth. The hinge groaned once, then went silent. They both froze, waiting for the familiar squeal that never came. The lieutenant leaned out the window, staring at the door like it had performed a trick. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "It actually works." Sam smiled faintly. "Told you. Nature's got her own way of fixing things." Brooks shut off the engine, stepped out, and walked toward him through the rain. How much of that stuff can you make? Depends on how much honey you take from me, Sam said, half joking, half serious. The lieutenant's gaze softened. Keep making it. I'll get word back to you. Then, without another word, he climbed into the truck and drove off into the storm. For a long moment, the only sound was the fading growl of the engine and the soft hiss of rain against tin. Sam stood under the eaves, letting the water run down his face, unsure if what just happened was a miracle or a mistake. Over the next few days, he worked harder than he ever had. The barn became a workshop of glass jars, tin pails, and bubbling pots of amber liquid. He mixed by instinct, adjusting the ratio of wax to oil until the texture felt right between his fingers, thick enough to hold, thin enough to spread. The air grew heavy with the scent of burnt sugar and smoke. At night, when the bees slept and his mother's lamp went out in the house, Sam stayed awake, testing the mixture on whatever metal he could find. Tools, locks, hinges, even his old tractor engine. Each test brought the same quiet satisfaction. It worked. Then, just as quickly as the first truck had appeared, another came, this time under clear skies. 2 soldiers stepped out, one with an envelope marked "Official." Inside was a typed letter on government stationery. Preliminary field test successful. Noise reduction measurable. Designation: Sweet Silence Compound Number 7. Continue production pending further instruction. Sam held the letter in his hands, reading it twice to be sure he wasn't dreaming. Sweet silence. It was the strangest, most beautiful phrase he'd ever seen attached to something he'd made with his bare hands. He tacked the letter to the wall of his barn, right above the workbench, and got back to work. Within a week, barrels lined the floor, each one labeled SSC-7 in black paint. The army trucks came and went, picking up the shipments without explanation. Sam didn't know where they were headed or what they'd be used for, but it didn't matter. Every jar, every barrel was a piece of himself sent out into the unknown, a small rebellion against the feeling of being left behind. At night, he'd step outside, listening to the distant hum of planes heading east, and wonder if one day, somewhere across the ocean, someone would hear the sound of an engine gone quiet and think of a farmer in Iowa. He couldn't have known that those barrels were already being loaded onto ships bound for Europe. That in a matter of weeks, his bee spit would roll through the mud of Normandy, protecting men who had no idea who to thank for the silence that saved them. Across the Atlantic, the beaches of France were still raw from invasion. Craters filled with rainwater, fields scorched black by artillery. The air smelled of diesel, cordite, and fear. But in the chaos of rebuilding the front lines, another kind of army was at work. Mechanics, drivers, and engineers fighting a quieter battle against distance, mud, and machine failure. They called themselves the lifeline, the veins of the war. Without them, the men at the front would go hungry, and the tanks would go silent. That was where Sweet Silence Compound Number 7 made its debut. It arrived in plain barrels marked Engineering Material, Class A. The men who received them had no idea they were handling a farmer's experiment from Iowa. To them, it was just another new substance from the Quartermaster Corps. Yet the first time they brushed it on the hinges of a transport truck, something changed. The doors closed without shriek or echo. The gear joints moved smooth as silk. The smell of burnt sugar and wax filled the air, strange but strangely comforting. The crews began coating more parts, hood seams, axles, exhaust pipes, and the results were undeniable. The trucks ran quieter, smoother, and somehow cleaner, as if the noise itself had been sealed away. Word spread fast through the motor pools and supply camps. Drivers started calling it bee grease. Some joked ghost syrup. To the men in the field, names didn't matter. Results did. They noticed how patrols that used SSC-7 were harder for the enemy to detect. Convoys that once groaned and clattered through the hedgerows now rolled past enemy lines like shadows. For the first time since D-Day, American supply routes began moving under the cover of something close to stealth. Reports started trickling up the chain. Noise detection reduced, ambush rates dropping, delivery times improving. Officers couldn't explain it, but they didn't question success. Back home, Sam Walker still worked in his barn, unaware that his invention had already crossed from rumor to routine in the European theater. He kept melting and mixing, burning his fingers on hot wax. His back sore from lifting barrels. Every time a truck came to collect the compound, he'd watch it drive away until the dust vanished, wondering where those barrels would end up this time. Sometimes he imagined them in Italy, or maybe the Pacific. He never guessed they were already staining the boots of soldiers in Normandy. By mid-June, Allied supply convoys had turned the narrow roads of France into arteries of movement. The hedgerows made travel deadly. German snipers, mines, and traps waited around every turn. The trucks couldn't risk headlights at night. Even the sound of an engine could mean death. But something changed when sweet silence coated the metal. One after-action report described a column of trucks moving past an ambush zone without a single shot fired. The Germans had listened for the clank of engines but heard only wind and rain. Captain Lawrence Mendel of the 3rd Armored Division later wrote that his men moved like ghosts through the fog. The name stuck. Across camps from Saint-Lô to Carentan, ghost convoys became a quiet legend. They said you could tell which trucks carried the compound by the smell. Sweet, faint, and warm, like a bakery lost in the dark. One corporal joked that the bees back in America were doing their part for the war. Another said, "If the honey runs out, we're doomed." Soldiers started writing home about it, describing trucks that purred instead of roared. One photograph, grainy and water-stained, showed a mechanic crouched beside a wheel, a paintbrush in hand, applying a dark glaze to the metal. On the back, someone had scribbled, "Your stuff works." That photograph would find its way into a plain envelope and cross the ocean back to Iowa. When Sam opened it weeks later, he stared at it for a long time. The image was small and blurred, but he could see the faint shimmer on the metal, the outline of soldiers standing beside their silent machines. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the edge of the photo. He'd never met those men, would never know their names, but his work had reached them. For the first time, he felt connected to something larger than his farm, larger even than the war itself. Still, there were no letters from his brother. The radio reports spoke of progress, Allied troops pushing inland, liberating towns, but the cost was heavy. Every day, more names filled the lists printed in the local paper. Sam began to wonder if Daniel was still alive to see the things that his invention had helped make possible. Then, in early July, a new truck arrived at the farm, this time escorted by a pair of officers. One handed him a sealed envelope stamped with a government crest. Inside was an order authorizing expanded production up to 200 gallons a month and a destination he didn't recognize. To be shipped via Port of Liverpool for pre-invasion outfitting. He read it twice, realizing what it meant. His barrels were going to England, preparing for something massive, something the papers whispered about, but no one dared name. The world was holding its breath, and his bees were part of the plan. That night, as he sealed the last barrel and rolled it toward the truck, the air grew heavy. The horizon flickered with distant lightning, and thunder rolled across the plains. He stood in the doorway of his barn, watching the soldiers drive away, the storm reflecting in the puddles at his feet. The bees, restless in their hives, buzzed softly like a distant drum. He looked toward the darkening sky, thinking of the men who would soon rely on a farmer's foolish experiment. The barrels would leave Iowa at dawn, cross the ocean, and reach the fields of France within 10 days. Somewhere out there, on roads lined with danger, a convoy would run silent because of him. He didn't know which men it would save or if any would remember, but the thought stayed with him as the thunder faded into silence. Written a letter months ago, asking for warmth. What he couldn't yet imagine was that among those trucks waiting for his compound was one driven by a familiar pair of hands, the same hands that had written a letter months ago, asking for warmth. Sergeant Daniel Walker, Sam's younger brother, was now part of the Red Ball Express, the lifeline of Europe, the roaring, grinding artery that kept the Allied front alive. For weeks, his unit had been running supplies from the beaches of Normandy through the narrow farm roads of France, dodging air raids, mud, and ambushes. The work was relentless, the danger constant. But this morning, July 29, 1944, something felt different. Mechanics were brushing a strange dark coating onto the trucks, its smell oddly sweet beneath the diesel and sweat. The men joked about it, calling it honey grease or farmer's glue, never knowing the truth behind it. Daniel crouched beside his own truck, watching the compound glisten under the rising sun. It looked like melted amber. "What's this supposed to do?" he asked a corporal nearby. The man shrugged. "Keeps us quiet, they say. Guess it's the Army's way of keeping bees in the motor pool." The men laughed, though their voices were uneasy. War had taught them to doubt anything new that promised safety. Still, Daniel liked the smell. It reminded him of home, of clover fields, and the steady hum of his brother's hives. He shook the thought away. There was no time for nostalgia. The orders were clear. Roll at 2200 hours, no lights, no radios. The convoy would move under cover of darkness toward the Falaise region, where German forces were cornered, but still fighting with desperation. 200 trucks, 12 half-tracks, and nearly 500 men were about to cross ground soaked with danger. As the sun set, Daniel climbed into the driver's seat, adjusting his gloves. The air was thick with the scent of oil and sugar. Engines coughed to life one by one, the sound muffled, subdued. Normally, the start of a convoy was chaos, metal groaning, gears clanking. But tonight it felt different. The engines purred softly, almost politely, as if unwilling to wake the dead. The men exchanged nervous looks. Silence in war was never a good sign. Then came the hand signal to move out. One by one, the trucks rolled forward, tires crunching softly over the gravel. The first few miles passed uneventfully. The moon hid behind clouds, the countryside black and ghostly. Every turn of the road brought another breath held, another moment of quiet dread. Daniel focused on the faint silhouette of the truck ahead, its taillight covered with a slit of red cellophane. He could hear nothing but the hum of his engine and the soft rattle of canteens against the cab. To his left, hedgerows rose like dark walls, hiding everything beyond them. The Germans were out there somewhere, listening, waiting. At one point, Daniel glanced at the gauge cluster and saw his own reflection in the glass. Eyes tired but steady, he thought of Sam, of the bees working in rhythm, of how their hum had filled his boyhood summers. It was strange the things a man remembered on a night like this. An hour passed. The road turned to mud, the rain starting again. Somewhere ahead, a scout jeep signaled to slow down. A bridge was coming up, wooden, narrow, barely fit for one truck at a time. The convoy crept forward. Then, from the ridge beyond the river, a single flare arced into the sky, white at first, then red. The forest lit up like day. Daniel's stomach dropped. A German patrol had spotted movement. "Go, go!" someone shouted over the static. Engines roared, but even now they sounded strangled, restrained. Machine guns opened up from the hills. Bullets ripped through the night, tearing into dirt and water. Daniel gripped the wheel and slammed the throttle. The truck jolted forward, bouncing across the planks. Explosions flared behind him. 3 trucks hit, fire reflecting on the rain-slick road. But the rest of the convoy pressed on, the first half already clear of the bridge before the enemy could correct their aim. The Germans, disoriented by the muffled approach, had been late. That delay, those few seconds of quiet, made all the difference. When the shooting finally stopped, 197 trucks were still moving, carrying fuel, food, and medical supplies that would help close the trap around Falaise the following day. As dawn broke, Daniel parked under a line of trees and exhaled for what felt like the first time all night. The air smelled of smoke and wet wood, but also, faintly, of something sweet. He leaned against the hood, his heart pounding, and laughed quietly to himself. "Bees in the motor pool," he said under his breath. Hours later, when the convoy reached the rally point, Daniel tore a piece of canvas from a burned-out truck and scrawled a note in pencil. He folded it once, then twice, and slipped it into an envelope with a small scrap of fabric stained with the honey-colored compound. Weeks later, that envelope would arrive on a quiet Iowa morning. Sam was working by the hives when the mailman's Jeep pulled up. The letter was battered, edges singed. Inside was the folded note, short and smudged with grease. "We rolled silent and lived," it read. "Your honey got here before I did." Sam sank onto the step outside the barn, holding the letter in both hands. Around him, the bees moved lazily in the summer air, unaware that their labor had traveled halfway around the world. He didn't cry. He just sat there, staring out at the fields, the horizon washed gold by the rising sun. His brother was alive, and somehow, through the most unlikely of miracles, they had fought the same war together, one with steel and courage, the other with patience and faith. For the first time since it all began, Sam felt at peace. He didn't know it yet, but his war was almost over. O had made silence his weapon, and when the guns finally went quiet, no one would remember the beekeeper who had made silence his weapon. The battle for France gave way to the long, grinding march into Germany, and the world shifted again. By the time victory was announced, the war had consumed nearly everything: cities, lives, and memories. What survived was mostly written in the language of numbers: tonnage delivered, miles advanced, divisions deployed. Somewhere inside those numbers, buried between statistics on tires and engine oil, there was a single line that mentioned temporary field compound, civilian origin, Iowa. A note so small it could have been missed entirely. Sam never saw that line. He didn't have to. He knew, deep down, that what he'd done had mattered, even if no one ever said it aloud. By the winter of 1945, the trucks had stopped coming. The orders ceased, the letters slowed, and the war that had once demanded everything from him now seemed to have forgotten his name. He stored the last few barrels of the Sweet Silence compound in a corner of the barn, sealed tight, marked with fading black letters. SSC-7. Then he went back to the rhythm of farming, the hum of bees, the hiss of wind through corn, the long, steady silence of peace. But peace had its own kind of noise. It was the creak of old wood, the ticking of clocks, the sound of nothing after years of engines and thunder. For the first few months, Sam struggled to sleep. He kept expecting to hear the rumble of a truck outside, the shout of soldiers, the clatter of empty barrels. Instead, he heard only the soft, endless hum of his hives. In that sound, he found comfort. The bees didn't care who won or lost. They worked because that was what they were made to do: to build, to heal, to make something sweet out of a world that too often turned bitter. When Daniel came home that spring, he was thinner, quieter, and carried the same kind of silence Sam had heard in the fields after a storm. They didn't talk much about the war. They didn't have to. Some stories, especially the ones that matter most, are told without words. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sun fell over the horizon, Daniel broke the silence. "I heard they tested your stuff on Navy ships too," he said, with a faint smile. Sam laughed softly. "Well, maybe I sank a U-boat or two." It was the first real laugh they'd shared in years. For a moment, the heaviness between them lifted, replaced by the simple joy of being alive. The years moved quietly after that. The government contracts ended, the war plants closed, and people like Sam returned to their small corners of America. The headlines turned to politics and prosperity. No one talked about how a farmer's bees had once played a part in winning a war, but the memory lingered, like the faint smell of honey in old wood. By the 1960s, Sam's barn leaned under its own weight, the paint peeling, the tools rusting where they hung. Yet the hives still thrived, and, every spring, the air filled with the same golden hum that had carried him through the darkest years. Sometimes, when the evening was still, he'd sit with a jar of honey in his hands and watch the sunlight filter through it, remembering the way the trucks had gleamed under the same light as they rolled out of his yard. He didn't need a medal or a headline. The quiet satisfaction of knowing was enough. In 1970, illness came like an early frost. Sam spent his last weeks in the farmhouse, the sound of bees drifting through the open window. When he passed, the paper in Harland, Iowa, printed a short obituary. 4 lines, maybe 5. Samuel Walker, lifelong farmer and beekeeper, died Sunday at home, survived by his brother Daniel. No mention of the war or the compound, or the convoys that had rolled through history under his invisible shield. The story could have ended there, like so many others, a name fading into the soil that had raised it. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with him. Decades later, in the 1980s, a boy exploring the overgrown farm found something half buried under the floorboards of the old barn. A rusted metal box, its hinges fused by time. Inside was a glass jar, the lid cracked, the contents hardened to amber, and folded beside it was a note written in Sam's familiar hand. The ink faded but still legible. It read, "Sweet silence, remember us." The boy didn't understand what it meant, not then. But when the jar was brought to a local museum, a historian traced the markings, SSC-7, Iowa, 1944, and uncovered the forgotten file buried deep in military archives. The discovery never made national news. It was a story too small, too gentle, to compete with louder histories. But for those who read it, it carried something rare. Proof that even the smallest acts, the quietest ideas, can ripple through the world in ways no one can measure. Today, in a museum display case in Des Moines, that jar sits under soft light. Visitors pass by it without stopping, most never realizing that inside that glass once lay the compound that helped save countless lives. Yet for a few who pause long enough to read the small plaque, the story unfolds. A man, his bees, and the sound of silence that changed the course of war. It's easy to believe that history is written by generals and politicians, by men who command armies or sign treaties. But sometimes, it's written by someone standing in a field, surrounded by bees, who refuses to believe that being small means being powerless. Samuel Walker never sought recognition. He gave the world something it didn't even know it needed, a weapon that saved lives instead of taking them. And in doing so, he left behind a truth far more enduring than fame. That ingenuity, compassion, and quiet work can echo louder than gunfire. Maybe that's why, even now, when the museum grows still at closing time, the curators say they can sometimes hear a faint hum near the exhibit, not of machines, but of bees, steady and unending, as if reminding us that silence, too, has its heroes. And maybe that's the real legacy of Sam Walker, that the sweetest victories in history aren't the ones shouted from rooftops. They're the ones whispered by those who chose to build rather than destroy. So the next time you hear the low hum of bees in summer, listen closely. You might just hear the echo of a man who proved that even in war, silence can save lives. Tell me, if one farmer's idea could change the course of a world at war, what quiet idea might change yours?